Rabbi Shmooze here. Had some time on my hands, thought I'd make a short little clip explaining a topic that people have asked about. What is a heretic? Now, we have to understand that the idea of a heretic halachically really doesn't mean anything. It's more of a social construct. How so? Well, it rarely appears in the Mishnah. It really got its legs by the Amoraim in the Gemara. Just because with all the division in Israel as they were being occupied by Rome, you had a lot of splinter groups rising up, mainly because the Beis Din Hagadol, the Sanhedrin, didn't have as much power as they used to. So there's a lot of questions that they failed to answer. So this gave birth to sectarianism. Now, sectarianism in itself is not bad as long as it doesn't contradict halakha. Right? I think the closest thing we have in halakha, an actual halakha to an actual heretic, is the notion of a zakin mamre. The Rambam has a whole book on this. It's called Hilchos Mamre. A zakin mamre is a rebellious elder. Now, this appears black and white as halakha, that this type of individual is put to death because, one, he has a high status in the Jewish community. That means he's one of the zakenim, he's one of the leaders of the generation. He most likely has smicha, and he's directly going against a ruling brought down by the court. All right, not that he personally disagrees. This is one thing that these guys online who constantly call everybody a heretic don't understand, that there is no religious test in terms of belief in the Jewish world. Right? You could technically believe what you want. It's what you do, both in keeping the written law and the oral law. It's what you do. The oral law specifically, what we know as halakha le'maseh, right? Because that's what we discuss more, just because there's more of it. So there is no actual din as a heretic, no status as a heretic in Jewish law, but the notion of a zakin mamre, that someone who actually has a stature, who can do damage in the Jewish world, teaches contrary to what the court instructs. So if the court, the Sanhedrin, tells Israel to go right, and he specifically not believes that they should go left, but publicly teaches others to go left, contrary to what the court says, that person is liable the death penalty. That's it. Now, the idea of a heretic is really premature in the Mishnah. Now, the notion even of a min in the Mishnah really deals with the arba minim, right? The four species. It's always practical. It's always typically tied to an actual mitzvah in the Torah. But anyways, when someone calls someone a heretic nowadays, I mean, honestly, what charge would they bring to the court, right? He's a heretic in what, right? Because what it really means nowadays is that you're going against what's popular. And clearly things that were popular in the time of the Rambam were not popular now, just like things that were popular in the time of Rabbi Akiva are not things that are popular now. Clearly, Rabbi Akiva existed amongst us. Nowadays, he would also be labeled a heretic by these other rabbis, just because they don't really understand how the hierarchy in Judaism works, right? It's Brises, Mishnah, and then there's everything else. In other words, what makes you a Jew is believing in the 5 books of Moses, specifically the laws in the 5 books of Moses, to do them, and believing in halakha le'maseh, what appears in the Mishnah from people who had actual smicha, not people who are commenting about it, right? But the actual source material brought down by Tanaim and before. Now, Amoraim do bring a lot to the table, but mainly when they're quoting another Tana, when they bring a brisa. That's really what Talmud Bavli brought to the table. They brought down all these brises, reminding us that, you know what, there's other portions of Mishnaic literature that we may have overlooked. So when someone calls you a heretic, don't feel so bad. First of all, it's just a way to write you off. It means that they don't want to debate you, or they cannot debate you, because the term really doesn't mean anything nowadays. Now, colloquially, people don't want to deal with anyone labeled as a heretic, but this is why it's really the worst form of Lashon Hara out there, Motze Shemer out there, because it gets people to write you off and feel like they shouldn't dialogue with you or debate with you. But the truth is, the vast majority of people who use that term heretic don't know how Jewish law functions in general. I mean, don't really know much about Jewish history, which I think is essential to understanding Yahadut in general. Understanding or having a clear chronological understanding of Jewish history, and especially when all these laws were introduced like this, you're able to distinguish between minhagim, halachot. So that is the bulk of what I had to say on the notion of what a heretic is. Now, this is another thing I wanted to talk about, the notion of the Yud Gimel Karamuda, the Rambam's 13 Principles of Faith, right? It's been colloquially understood since the Rambam. Now, you have to understand who the Rambam was. The Rambam is important to us because of Mishneh Torah, essentially. Right? Also for his Parsha Mishnayot, for his commentary to the Mishnah, but mainly for Mishneh Torah, which is his codification of all of Jewish law. That means his personal opinions, which I would say is maybe 6% of what is in Mishneh Torah. We appreciate, although we understand that it is optional to believe, right? Because again, he wasn't a Tana, he didn't have smicha. He's appreciated for what he brought to the table, or what he brings to the table. But his personal opinions are just that, personal opinions. People nowadays make no distinction between a rabbi's personal opinions and when they're just reiterating Chazal. So, for example, there's been a debate in the Jewish world for a while now, what's a Jew actually required to believe? So the understanding is, let's say, from the corner of the Radbaz. So the Radbaz teaches that a Jew really doesn't have to believe in anything, he just has to keep Torah. Rabbi Yosef Albo in Sefer HaIkarim, he says that a Jew must believe in three things. It slips my mind exactly what those three things are. And we all know the Rambam's 13 Principles. That was the Rambam's rendition on what a Jew must believe. Now, there's a great book on this topic by Rabbi Mark Shapiro. I believe he's a YU Musmach. He's, I think he's either Rosh Hashiva or just a rabbi or Maggid Shir in Yeshiva Scranton. But he writes a book called The Limits of Orthodox Theology. And there he brings down many sources of rabbis who disagreed with the Rambam's enumeration of any set of laws or ideas that people must believe in, because it was very controversial for him to make that statement. Now, it's not that we ridicule people who believe like the Rambam does. Heck, I believe, and I would say 99% of what he brings down there in Perek Chelik. And just to be accurate, actually, Rabbi David Bar Chaim had a whole video on this, that the Yud Gimel Karamuna that we have nowadays, which is pretty similar to what appears in Yigdal and the Animamim, is not really what the Rambam wrote. That's an abridgment that actually nobody knows who compiled. To really know what the Rambam had to say of the 13 Principles, you had to go back to his Hakdama to Perek Chelik, which is where they got the synopsis of the 13 Principles. He challenged, to quote Rabbi David Bar Chaim, I hope I quote him accurately, he challenged the notion that one must await Mashiach daily. Right? That's sort of, it's sort of antithetical to Judaism to assume that Mashiach should come every minute when one, Israel hasn't done tshuva. I mean, the state of Jews nowadays to assume that God is just going to redeem them just because time is ticking down seems almost contrary to the message we see in Torah, right? Teshuvah is everything. First, Israel has to do teshuvah. But anyways, yeah, he proved that that's not what it really said. That's what it says in the abridgment we have. That's what it says in Yigdal, but that's not what it says in the actual 13 Principles. And I make the same argument with Techiyat HaMeitim. What is brought down as Techiyat HaMeitim, if you understand it contextually as the Rambam taught it, it is not what people actually believe nowadays regarding Techiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead. According to the Rambam, first of all, the Rambam was accused first of not believing in the resurrection of the dead, which is why he had to write a whole treatise saying, yes, I do believe in it, right? Almost giving people what they wanted to hear, because he excludes it from Hilchot Melachim, where it should appear in Mishneh Torah. I mean, he slightly mentions it in Hilchot Teshuvah, but chronologically, where it should appear alongside the laws of Mashiach and the end of days and all that stuff, the Rambam excludes it. So when he says, sure, I believe in it, he basically says, I believe in the resurrection of the dead in the way that people resurrect just to die again, which is basically contrary to what everyone else believes, right? The Ramban teaches that it's a perpetual resurrection. Similar to Mashiach, the Rambam also believes that Mashiach will eventually die and his kid will take over and on, and this is still conditional. right? If Israel screws up again, they'll go into Galut again. That's contrary to what many rabbis teach about Yamot HaMashiach, and it's perpetual. It's never going to end. This and that. That means God's essentially going to give everyone a lobotomy that they won't be able to sin anymore, which be the only way that, according to Torah, we would remain in any perpetual redemptive state. But anyways, this shows that even with the notion of Techiyat HaMeitim, the resurrection of the dead on the Rambam, it's not as clear as the way people teach it nowadays. So it's easy to say, oh, well, you're going against the Rambam's 13 principles. But they themselves are actually going against it in many different ways. Not just the 13 principles, but the Rambam in general. Right? If the average Kabbalist, who let's say would point his finger at me and say, oh, well, I'm a heretic because I happen not to adhere to what this Gadol said, or in particular the Rambam. You know what? That according to the Rambam, virtually every Chassid, every Kabbalist, I mean, for sure, every Lurianic Kabbalist would be held in contempt and as a heretic because the anthropomorphic representations of God, of him having a leg, an arm, a sense of humor, the notion of God even being a king is contrary to the Rambam, right? I mean, even though the Rambam himself contradicts himself, he talks about God living in a palace. That's also some sort of anthropomorphic understanding. In terms of limitations of God, why does the Rambam have a huge problem with Trinitarians? It's because to split God into pieces is to limit God. What do you think the Partzufim and the Sefirot and the Atzilut and Tzimtzum, all these notions would put you on the Rambam's bad list? People don't understand this. I think this is my strength when I do my debates. I bring up sources that are easily researchable, but that just people don't know about, because people get tunnel vision when they study halakha. They typically hold by one rabbi or one gadol, and they think that if you disagree with that gadol, you're disagreeing with gadolei hador, like all the gadolim nowadays. It's very short-sighted. It's actually not true, and it really shows that they just pick and choose as well. Or the demagogue when they say, oh, Chazal teach, or the rabbis teach. There's no consensus on what the rabbis teach. Okay, the only consensus is that we have to listen to the rulings of the court, right? Parshat Shoftim, Deuteronomy chapter 17, the mitzvah of lo tasur, of not straying from this court. That's really what Elu ve'elu divrei Elohim Chaim actually means, right? Elu ve'elu, that all these opinions brought down by Tanaim who have smicha, that all these are the opinions of the living God, because the understanding is that you can't stray from the right to the left of what this court rules. Now, it's true, in the time of Hillel and Shammai, the din was many times split into two. No one actually knew which way to go, but the understanding is that anyone who paskins outside of Chazal was considered, I guess to use your favorite word, a heretic, or someone outside of the fold. But it's fine, right? You're still keeping all the commandments as they were meant to be kept, i.e. living and memorizing the 5 books of Moses, and adhering to halakha, no matter how ambiguous those halachot may seem, because that's what the mitzvah of lo tasur means, of not straying, or the prohibition that one shouldn't stray. You're adhering to one understanding, right? Judaism as it functions today, it's really Rambam Judaism. Okay, hands down, that's the way it works. We go by the Rambam's Masorah on what the final halachot actually are. This is why Shulchan Aruch is not really a codification of Jewish law, it's a compilation of Jewish law, right? The Rambam was a codifier, the Machaber was a compiler. He compiled the best out of 3, the Rosh, the Rif, and the Rambam. There's not much beef between the Rambam and the Rif. He says that he could count, I believe, in 2 hands how many times he actually disagrees with the Rif, right? I think the bigger beef is between the Rosh and the Rambam, teaching us that people had a different Masorah on how to understand Chazal, but it didn't really matter as long as you went by the rulings of the court. People have to understand that Judaism was not really formulated in the time of the Amoraim, and even in the time of the Tanaim, but actually before. This system was put in place way before the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah, way before Sefer Shoftim. This was put in place in the time of Zakenim and Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay, so only because an Amara may teach a certain idea, or even a late Tana teach another idea, it doesn't change the way Judaism functions. Judaism in a nutshell is the 5 books of Moses and halakha. What is halakha? Now, halakha has nothing to do with belief. It has nothing to do with folklore and legend. It ultimately deals with laws ruled into existence by the court. Ruled into existence by the court. That means, by definition, that it cannot contain anything metaphysical. Because if the court had the authority to institute anything metaphysical, wouldn't they just institute that the Messiah should come tomorrow or that our enemies should be drowned in the sea? Of course they had no power. This is clear. The Rambam writes this in the Hilchos Sanhedrin, that the power of the court only existed via voting, that they would vote things into existence. The greatest Chachamim of the generation will get together and vote. Now, one error that many people make is that power does not extend to rabbis nowadays. Rabbis nowadays have no judicial power in the Jewish world. Now, it's a great thing to have a Rav Mufhak or have different Rebbeim. I think this is what a Asalech HaRav really means, to bounce your idea of many knowledgeable people, right? A rabbi, a supposed posek, there's no real status of a posek nowadays. No one could really create halakha for the Jewish people. However, a community does have the right to establish a posek for themselves. I mean, someone who's going to decide which way the halakha is going to go for that community. And that's essentially what you have nowadays. If you live in Brooklyn and I don't know, like you have a problem with what David Cohen brings to the table, then I don't know, go to Muncie, like daven in a different shul, right? If you don't like the rulings of one community or the customs of one community, go to a different community. Now, this is not really possible when the ruling came down from the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin ruled for all of Israel. So it's not all or nothing. This is why it's hard to explain this in a 2-minute lecture. And people really get stuck in what's called, to quote Thomas Sowell, first stage thinking. And Judaism really can't be explained with little sound bites, because those in the religious world who teach like I do won't say that Rav Eliyashiv had no power, that Rav Ovadia Yosef had no power. No, even though we make a distinction between actual smicha that ended in around the beginning of the 5th century and what we have nowadays, which is really a form of smicha that was invented in 1538 of the Common Era. Even though we make a distinction, we don't belittle the leaders of the generation, whether you want to call them Gedolim, whether you want to call them Tzaddikim. We don't belittle them. However, we do say that their rulings are only binding on those who accept those rulings as binding, not binding on all the Jewish people. That's one thing these guys don't understand, that because I happen to disagree with Rabbi Mizrahi or Rabbi Yaron Reuven on a small area, I'm sure we agree more than we disagree, they have the chutzpah to call you a heretic. That's not how Judaism functions, really. You have to be pretty detached from the Jewish world to come to a conclusion that you're going to call someone a name just because they don't hold like you do religiously. Judaism, especially people who've lived in Israel, know how colorful and how diverse the Jewish people really are. There's different opinions, right? But I guess you don't pick that up unless you've lived in Israel. And that's probably the biggest advantage I've had, or the thing that has equipped me the most to not just relate to the Jewish people, but to teach Torah, is living in Israel. I lived in Israel for 5 years. I was in yeshiva for about 2 of those years, but I was a Makarv in Hebrew U, and I've met tons of rabbis, and I've discussed my ideas with many other people. As a matter of fact, discussing my ideas is really what has refined them. I learned with Timanim, I learned with Ashkenazim. Israel is a true theological melting pot. However, when you spend too much time in America, you start thinking that you're the only sheriff in town, which really makes you look like an amateur, because it shows how you are not aware that the Talmud is a sea, or Mishnaic literature is a sea of knowledge, of in many cases binding halachot that may be binding to you and not binding to other people, because that person may hold by another brisa or another Tana. All right, but anyways, I think I should keep this video a little short. Guys, for everything Jewish, please visit TorahJudaism.com. Hit my classes up every Monday night at 9:30 live. Also, we're doing classes every Saturday night at 11:30. Right, this is a class that my good friend Dr. Abraham created for students in India, but everyone is welcome to join. Thank you and be well.